Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Hello, welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense, on cable TV and the internet for over 26 years now. We have a great guest tonight, Mr. Steve Elliott. Steve is an old associate who's worked on our Hemp News print and Hemp News online news service. He's now working for Leaf magazine, so we'll be talking with him about cannabis journalism and activism and philosophy over the past several years. I'm taping this from Lima, Peru, and we're here for the Expo Cannabis Peru, the Copa del Sol, and Mila Janssen's Dabadoo Peru tour. So without further ado, we're going to get to our Hemp News segment and then our interview with Mr. Steve Elliott. But first, let's bring on our infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Okay, welcome back to our Hemp News segment. Fulfilling a high-profile campaign pledge, President Joe Biden recently announced that his office will be issuing pardons to several thousand Americans with federal convictions for marijuana possession offenses, including me. President Biden announced, quote, "There are several thousand people who have prior federal convictions for marijuana possession who may be denied employment, housing, or educational opportunities as a result. My action will help relieve the collateral consequences arising from those convictions," end quote. But almost all marijuana arrested are for violation of state or local laws, not federal law. As a result, White House officials have estimated that the president's directive will bring relief to an estimated 6,500 people, only a fraction of the nearly 29 million Americans who've been arrested for marijuana violations over the past several decades. Nevertheless, Biden's actions are in a seismic shift in the way those inside the Beltway talk and think about cannabis. Historically relegated as a fringe political issue, Biden's foray in the arena of marijuana reform legitimizes legalization as a subject worthy of consideration and action by those at the highest levels of government. Further, it's recognition by the President of the United States, no less, that America's nearly 100-year experiment with cannabis criminalization has been an abject failure. Indeed, the administration's actions acknowledge that arresting and criminalizing those who possess and consume marijuana does more harm than good. This acknowledgement thus begs the question, why are law enforcement in states and cities continuing to prosecute hundreds of thousands of people every year for behavior that most Americans no longer believe ought to even be a crime? It's a valid question, and it's one that leaders in Congress, as well as many state elected officials, now need to answer. By making the first move, the president's amplified the pressure on Congress, and the Senate in particular, and Democratic leadership to respond. According to polling data, nearly half of registered voters, including majorities of younger voters and Democrats, believe that repealing marijuana prohibition ought to be a legislative priority for Congress. Nevertheless, for far too long, elected officials, and those in the Senate in particular, have provided little more than lip service. Specifically, Senator Chuck Schumer pledged prior to 2020's election, quote, "If I become majority leader, I will put this on the floor and it's likely to pass," end quote. Yet, in nearly 2 years since then, no standalone marijuana legislation has made it through the Senate to the president's desk. But all that could change now. By getting out in front of this issue, President Biden's now receiving well-deserved attention and accolades. His actions are not only good policy, they're good politics. Polling finds that a solid majority of Americans support the expungement of criminal records for those convicted of marijuana-related possession crimes. But ultimately, the White House can't repeal or amend federal marijuana laws unilaterally. Like it or not, Congress must weigh in on the issue by passing legislation. Governors and state lawmakers must do their part too. President Biden's demonstrated that the time is now, and most Americans agree. In fact, 67% of U.S. voters say, quote, "Nobody should be in jail for the possession of marijuana," and an even greater percentage oppose its categorization as a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law, according to nationwide data compiled by the Data for Progress firm. 68% of Democrats, as well as 70% of independents, and 54% of Republicans say that no one should be incarcerated for possessing cannabis. Voters support legislation to legalize marijuana at a federal level for all adults by a similar percentage. With the midterm elections fast approaching, federal lawmakers and Democratic leadership in particular would be wise to heed voters' call and to fast-track legislation to amend America's failed and unpopular marijuana prohibition laws. Doing so would galvanize the Democratic base while simultaneously appealing to many Republicans and independents in a way that few, if any, other hot-button political issues would. It would affirm America's long-standing principles of federalism and appeal to Americans' deep-rooted desire to be free from undue government intrusion into their daily life. Most importantly, repealing marijuana prohibition would adjust federal law to America's rapidly changing cultural and legal landscape. Voters support removing cannabis from its Schedule I prohibition classification by even larger margins, including 80% of respondents, including 88% of Democrats and 70% of Republicans, say that federal law should not classify marijuana in the same category as LSD or heroin. Since 1970, the U.S. Controlled Substances Act has categorized marijuana in the same classification as heroin, defining it as a substance with high potency for abuse and a lack of accepted safety, and no currently accepted medical use in treatment in the United States, end quote. Over the past years, lawmakers in nearly 24 states have enacted legislation explicitly facilitating the process of having select marijuana convictions expunged, vacated, or otherwise set aside or sealed from public view. These laws have led state and local officials to expunge or seal the record of over 2 million people with prior cannabis convictions. In some states, the law provides for automatic review and expungement of marijuana-related records, while in others, such as Oregon, those who wish to have their record sealed must actively petition the courts for relief. In addition, the governors of Colorado, Nevada, Illinois, and Washington State have granted an estimated 30,000 pardons to those with low-level marijuana convictions. In response to separate polling data, 64% agreed that marijuana possesses positive health effects, and 53% said it was safer than alcohol. A majority of Republicans did not agree with the latter statement, nor did they believe that people of color are disproportionately impacted by marijuana enforcement laws. A 2020 analysis, however, by the American Civil Liberties concluded, quote, black people are 3.64 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession, notwithstanding comparable usage rates, end quote. Our last story tonight is from Oklahoma. Voters will decide on a citizens' initiative measure legalizing the adult use marijuana market in a special election to be held in March. Republican Governor Kevin Stitt issued an executive proclamation calling for the special election on Tuesday, March 7th, 2023. Oklahoma's State Question 820, sponsored by the group Oklahomans for Sensible Marijuana Laws, permits adults to legally possess and home cultivate personal use quantities of cannabis while also establishing a licensed retail marketplace. Those with past marijuana convictions or those who are currently incarcerated for certain cannabis crimes would be able to petition the courts for either record expungement or resentencing consideration. In July, advocates for State Question 820 in Oklahoma turned in nearly twice the total number of signatures to qualify the initiative for the 2022 ballot. However, the Secretary of State's office took an excessive amount of time to ultimately verify the proponents' signatures. Opponents of the measure then filed a series of questionable legal challenges litigating various facets of the campaign, including challenges to the initiative's summary language. Although the judges ultimately dismissed those challenges, they did so after time had elapsed for state officials to include State Question 820 on this November's printed ballots. Michelle Tilley, the campaign director for the movement Yes on 820, said, quote, after all the delays caused by the new signature count process, we're excited to finally be going to the ballot on March 7th, 2023, so that Oklahomans can experience the benefits of State Question 820 without further delay. Republicans, Libertarians, Democrats, and Independents alike are excited to stop wasting law enforcement resources and start reaping the hundreds and millions of dollars in financial benefit that come with legalizing, regulating, and taxing recreational marijuana for adults in Oklahoma. Oklahoma's had one of the most successful medical marijuana programs in the country. Voters in 5 states, Arkansas, Maryland, Missouri, North Dakota, and South Dakota, will be deciding on similar adult use legalization measures this November. So that's the end of our hemp news segment tonight. I'd just like to say that I expect to get 2 pardons from President Biden. I was arrested in the United States Capitol building back in 1990, and I was convicted of possessing marijuana. And then in 1993, I was convicted of possessing marijuana in my home here in Portland, Oregon, when the police kicked in the door and said I had been growing marijuana, which I had. And a jury, though, decided that they didn't want to convict me of growing marijuana because it would lead to 10 years in prison. They didn't think that was right. And I allowed the judge to find me guilty of simple possession of marijuana, which he said he would do. Thank you, Judge. Now I look forward to getting 2 pardons from President Biden. Anyway, now we have Mr. Steve Elliott an old associate of ours who's been working in journalism and cannabis politics. So stay tuned and keep working to restore hemp. Good morning. I'd like to welcome an old friend, associate, and longtime cannabis groundbreaking journalist, Steve Elliott. Good day, Steve. This is going to be at night, but we're recording this in the morning as we do it. How are you doing?
Thank you, Paul. I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure's all mine. We worked together for many years on our hemp news online and occasionally in print.
We did.
E-magazine and newspaper. And you were a groundbreaking cannabis journalist before that. So let's go in and talk about that. I think you were one of the first. First, let's talk about your background and how you came to be a cannabis journalist.
Okay. I started smoking pot when I was 17 back in the 70s. And I was a journalist on a separate track because of Woodward and Bernstein. Actually, I decided back during the Watergate days I was going to do that. But those two tracks didn't come together until much later in my life. And it took until I was 49 years old that those two tracks converged. What happened was that I got diagnosed with hepatitis C, and I was living in Washington State in the Seattle area at the time. And once I got my diagnosis, of course, I researched.
What year was that?
That was 2009. And once I got my diagnosis, I started researching, and I found out that Hep C is a qualifying condition under Washington's medical marijuana law. So I got my patient card and started researching and blogging about it. I already had an existing blog called Reality Catcher, and I started blogging about my medical marijuana journey on there. And I discovered ways of sharing that blog online that got it actually some attention and some eyeballs. And Village Voice, unlikely story, but Village Voice happened to have some talent scouts out on the net at the time. They saw the blog, and they were just about to start up a marijuana blog themselves. And they asked me if I would run that for them. And I quickly said yes, and started running that in November 2009. And that's how the journalism and the cannabis activism came together. So I started doing tokeofthetown.com.
So it all happened pretty quick. You went from being a regular mainstream journalist, so to speak, and then you got this job through the Village Voice.
Yes. So Village
and
Voice.
That was published in the Seattle Week, right?
That quickly led to Seattle Weekly also asked me to review medical marijuana dispensaries in the Seattle area and throughout Washington State. So then I had those two tracks going. I was writing a print column for the Seattle Weekly at the same time that I was managing the blog for Village Voice. And of course, the Village Voice media chain owned Seattle Weekly, so it all dovetailed together pretty neatly. But first thing I knew, I had people wanting their dispensaries and or products reviewed there in the Seattle Weekly. So I was hearing from lots of people and getting a lot more attention than I was used to. So that the tokeofthetown.com blog went very well. And before you knew it, we were getting over 500,000 hits a month and lots of attention. And of course, that's a double-edged sword, because when you get a lot of eyeballs, you're also going to get a lot of criticism. So I had to learn to get used to that. And when you're doing not just journalism, but advocacy journalism, where you are definitely representing a particular point of view, of course, pro-cannabis in this case, you're going to get some blowback from a lot of people. And also when you're doing a review column, a medical marijuana review column that's in a print paper and a lot of people are reading it, you're going to get some unhappy proprietors, because not everybody is going to get a good review. Of course, the vast majority of them did, And I can recall with some nostalgia at this point those medical marijuana days of 29 and 2011 and 2012, because at that time things weren't so locked down and regulated as they are now under 520, under the adult use marijuana law they have in Washington. And of course, when we did go to full legalization in Washington, we did so with a less than ideal law. And in Washington state, we were, of course, one of the first two states, along with Colorado, that did so. And we didn't have this down to an exact science yet. The legalization laws that are being advanced in states like Missouri now are superior to the one that was passed in Washington in 2012 for several reasons. And one of those being no home grow. That is a crucial determinant for me between a good legalization law and a not so good one. I mean, when you have the man stepping between you and your herb and saying, look, okay, you can have it, but you got to get it from me and you can't grow it for yourself. We're not there yet. I mean, you can see the end zone from there, but you haven't scored a touchdown. You may be in the red zone. And the thing that concerns me about these less than perfect legalization laws, I'm all for incremental progress whenever we can make it. But the thing that really concerns me is it's been a decade now since Washington State passed its law. And some of the other activists, were trying to get me to get on board with 502, and they were telling me, look, we'll fix it after it passes. Well, it's been 10 years now, and there's still no home grow in Washington. It's been 10 years, and they still have.
I'd like to just say, yeah, I don't know. My signal's not too good where I'm at, but maybe I can jump here and here and say that, in 2012, when Washington passed I-520, and then Colorado passed Amendment 64, the same time we had our initiative on the ballot in Oregon is Measure 80. And the Drug Policy Alliance invested $6 million in legalization in Washington state. And the Marijuana Policy Project, which is a more membership-based organization, put $3.5 million of their dollars toward legalization in Colorado. Same time, I took some of our clinic money, and in getting to the ballot, I had spent over $2 million over 5 years. But during the campaign, I could only spend about another $100,000.
Wow.
So in the end, Washington State passed with a terrible law from the Drug Policy Alliance. And it turns out, we now know in retrospect that the Drug Policy Alliance, funded by George Soros, is in league with the Canadian cannabis companies that are trying to take over the national market and the international market. I'm here in Mexico, spent a lot of time in Colombia. The Canadian cannabis corporations are everywhere, and they're trying to impose their own laws. And I was a victim of them. They attacked me and stole everything. And you were kind of tied up in that. You were working for us. For at some point, Toke of the Town went down because of conflict with some of those businesses. And then you started working with our CRRH, your Campaign for the Restoration Regulation of Hemp.
I did.
You did that for a number of years. Do you want to talk about how it went down with Toke of the Town and the passage of Washington's recreational law, and then working with us, and how that came to an end?
Yeah, that was a very supercharged time. A lot of people, were very invested in one way or the other on 502. And like you say, 502 was such a weak law. It was a terrible law in many ways because, number one problem, no home grow. But there were a number of other fronts. That's what
cannabis corporations want, is no home grow. They don't want us to be able to grow our own. They want us to just buy it from them. From
their monopoly, basically. But that was a deal breaker for me, as was the 5 nanogram DUI limit. That's a hard limit, and 5 nanograms or over, they're going to say you're under the influence. And of course, that's nonsense. And most of us patients when we wake up in the morning, we're over 5 nanograms, and that's before we've taken any medicine at all. So that's just complete nonsense, and it was a deal breaker. And it breaks my heart that they still haven't advanced enough in Washington that they still don't have home grow. Arkansas, oddly enough, now that I'm living here, has legalization on the ballot with another law with no home grow where you have to go to the dispensaries. And it's very convenient here for the medical marijuana companies that are already established in Arkansas and a number of other states, and I suspect in some cases in Canada as well, because they get first in line when the adult use licenses for dispensaries and cultivation sites are handed out. So they're going all in on this legalization initiative. And right now in Arkansas, you see ads on both sides of the issue. And the ones against marijuana legalization here in Arkansas are leaning on the fear. They're leaning on we need to protect our kids, and they're leaning on roadside or roadway accidents. And most of that is just complete, blarney. But we work with what we have. It looks like Arkansas's law has a chance, despite all that. But to get back to Washington and to the 502 fight in 2012, that was basically it's something that the marijuana community in Washington and to an extent nationwide hasn't recovered from, because you still have people who hold grudges in regard to what went down there. I think a lot of the problem in Washington state is that when they went adult use, they didn't fold in medical marijuana like many other states since then have had the good sense to do. And that doesn't mean you have to give an unfair advantage to the medical marijuana operators. It just means let them sit at the table. Washington didn't do that. There was no clear transition from medical marijuana to adult use. There was rather a breaking point between the two. And Washington did unwise things like not letting many of the medical marijuana operators have licenses. They were very limited, the number of licenses to begin with. And lots of folks were frozen out. Folks who had, invested their life energy, their money, their savings, everything they had for years and years, decades in some instances. Those people, were left off from the table. And the ones that did get it in many cases in Washington state, the ones who did get licenses were people who actively worked against patient interests, worked against the rights of patients to have farmers markets, which are now legal in Washington. And that happened to have been one of the most beneficial parts of the medical marijuana community. Those farmers markets where they weren't just, you didn't go just to buy weed, you went to have a community, to talk with people and to learn. I never went to a farmer's market in Washington state that I didn't learn a lot more, both about cannabis and about growing it and about the people who grow it. And all of those things are valuable repositories of knowledge. And it's a shame how much was lost and how much ill will was engendered by the way in which that was done. It was so totally unnecessary. There didn't have to be that break off between medical
How is it?
marijuana.
Let's talk about how you ended. Yeah, let's talk about how you left Village Voice and Toke of the Town, and then you started working with Hemp News. Did that happen? I
Okay.
think that happened prior to the, or was it in conjunction with the legalization campaign in Washington State?
It was just after. Legalization passed in November 2009 or
2012.
or 2012. And then the following January 2013, is when I parted ways with Village Voice. And there were a number of factors in that, including some of the leading names, shall we say, in the marijuana reform movement with whom I had crossed swords. I've never been one to hide my light under a bushel when it comes to sharing my opinions on cannabis. I feel strongly about the plant, about the benefits it offers us, about the life benefits involved and the health benefits. And when people, in my views, are seeking to come between people who need the plant and the plant itself, then we usually end up on opposite sides of an issue. And it so happened that I probably picked a couple of people who were way more powerful than I was to cross swords with. And I won't name names at this point, but I think many of us remember that certain people in this movement, once you cross them, they can remove opportunities for you, both in the business of marijuana and in the marijuana community. So that kind of happened. Well, to my eternal gratitude, when that happened with Village Voice, you were there as my friend and as my employer, and Hemp News was a source of sustenance to me for several years there. I enjoyed working for Hemp News because of the editorial freedom that it afforded.
Yeah, I started Hemp News not as knowing it to be a publication, because it started online back in 1988. Back then, there was no World Wide Web, no graphics over the internet, really. It was all just text-driven Usenet news groups. And so I started
Right.
collecting news stories through the CompuServe news service. So you paid $6 an hour to link up to CompuServe, and then to access the news service where you had a Dropbox keywords, you could get news articles off the AP Wire, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the BBC. Any stories that came across with your keywords would drop into my file. So for a number of years, like 2 years, I was just reading these stories, and they were almost all in the mid to the late 80s, almost all bust stories. This person's been busted with this much. There's this much been busted here. This little lady was caught with that. Only rarely would there be stories that weren't about marijuana arrests. But still,
Right.
I was learning something, and I realized, I'm the only one that sees these. Nobody else has access to this kind of information on cannabis itself. So starting in 1988, I started collecting those stories on a weekly or monthly basis. Usually it was somewhere between there. And I would gather them in text, and I would post them to various Usenet news groups. And at that time, I had started importing hemp paper and fabric from China. So I used these news stories kind of as a additional way to get the word out there that my company at the time, Tree Free Eco Paper, has hemp paper products,
Right.
and we're supporting the hemp news. And so, when I chose the name Hemp News, it was because that was the maximum number of characters you could have in a file name. You could only have 8 characters in a file name. And so that was one of the driving forces behind that name. But according to Wikipedia, because, you are posting to it, we're posting our video Hemp News through our this cable access TV show. Wikipedia has noted that we're the oldest still existent publication. There were some others
Wow.
out there before I started putting it out in 1988, but
Mm-hmm.
none of them still survive. And so here we are. I think that's 34 years now, and we're still putting out our hemp news. But
Yeah.
once I saw that Toke of the Town had dropped you, I thought, well, I certainly could use more original content instead of copying and pasting other people's articles. Occasionally we get copyright notices like, oh, you violated our copyright, especially from like the Las Vegas newspaper and other newspapers saying, hey, you can't post our news, and so I thought it'd be great if you could repackage all these stories so
Right.
that we would have those copyright issues. And so I think you started, if you parted with Toke of the Town in January of 2013, I think you started with us like the next week.
I did, like almost immediately. And not only that, but I launched my own blog, my personal blog, tokesignals.com. And you not only hired me to work for Hemp News, But you took the ad money that you had been applying to Village Voices site, Toke of the Town, and you moved that over and you bought ad money on my blog, Toke Signals, which kept it going for a couple of years. So that actually was a very generous move on your part, and I'll always appreciate that.
Thank you. Now talk about your book. You published the Little Black Book on Marijuana, isn't that right?
That's right. It came out in 2011, and that was another ancillary benefit of the Village Voice gig, because there was a little publishing press in upstate New York, and they published a series of little black books on various, fine living things. They had done wine, chocolate, sex, fine dining, all these things, but they hadn't done marijuana yet. One of the life's pleasures. When they decided they were going to cover that, they called me and asked me if I would be interested in doing it. And, after a little bit of negotiation about the exact terms, I jumped on it because I thought, I could pass this by. I'm pretty busy right now, and I was at the time. But if I don't take this, I'm going to be haunted by it. Somebody else is going to do it, and they might not do it right. So I better do this if I want it done right. And I wrote that book. The interesting and challenging thing about the Little Black Book of Marijuana is Peter Pauper Press told me, okay, you have 20,000 words. And I said, okay, that's not much. You want to cover what? And they said, oh, just, the entire history of the interaction between humans and marijuana. And that includes, politics, medical, growing, everything, 20,000 words. So you talk about having to concentrate your thoughts down into their most distilled essence. I had to do that for that book, but it's a good discipline, a good writing discipline to practice, because I was able to get most of what I wanted in there. Only a couple of personal passages were excised by my editors at Peter Pauper Press. Maybe someday those might even go back in if I decide to flex my muscles in that regard. But right now, the Little Black Book of Marijuana is on its 4th edition. Every 3 or 4 years, they put out a new edition, and they're nice enough to let me update the political sections about which states are legal, things like that. Of course, a lot of the information, the historical information, going back 10,000 years and everything, that's not going to change in 3 years, because that's the solid rock, the solid foundation that
Well,
we built this culture.
archaeology keeps expanding what we know about the history of cannabis. When I first started reading about cannabis in like 1981, I read Ernest Abel's book, Marijuana, the First 12,000 Years. That was a very, very influential book on my development. But now we know from archaeology that the cannabis started spreading outside of its indigenous area in Central Asia through human cultivation about 25 to 28,000 years ago. And we look
Amazing.
at the Mediterranean basin, and we see that cannabis farming started in northern Italy about 13,000 years ago, long before the Romans, long before the Etruscans. So it's actually now 25,000 years, but
Yeah.
details are hard to know because there's no written records. It's all
Right.
prehistoric. You can only tell by kind of a crime scene investigation of putting together the various evidence. And in terms of the cultivation in Italy, what's now Italy, we don't know what it was back then, but
Right.
its cultivation probably spread out of the Scythian area and the Black Sea and the Azov Sea, and then came through into the Adriatic and north out the Mediterranean. And
Right.
so but they only know that because of pollen that they're able to take from these, because apparently pollen stands up to degradation much better than other plant
Right.
matter. And
Mhm.
so I just have to throw that in there, that things do change. In fact, that's why I'm in Mexico City right now. I give this talk that is my most popular. I have several, but the most popular one, and the one I like a lot, is cannabis, the first 25,000 years.
Right.
But back to you. So you started working with me and Hemp News, and talk about how that developed, please.
Okay, but first I just want to kind of tag on to what you said there. You know, that's a long-term relationship, a 25,000 year relationship between human beings and a plant. That's long-term. That's a commitment. And it is a wonderful thing because during that 25,000 years, we haven't been sitting still. We've both been evolving. We've been evolving as a human race, hopefully in consciousness as well, in no small part due to this plant, this cannabis plant. And the fact that we have the long-standing, loving relationship with another organism that is in fact a plant rather than an animal like us, is a wonderful thing to me. And it's a source of hope for nature. This kind of symbiosis, it fills me with hope and joy because this is a positive thing. It is a positive force in our universe. And when I think about that kind of a 25,000 year relationship between these two organisms, that makes me realize that we're going to get through this brief little burst of capitalism right now that is in some ways holding back the progress of the plant and of the people who use it, because capitalism finds ways to capitalize. And when it comes to cannabis, it's no different. You know, capitalism changes everything it touches with the money. And that is in large part what has been happening with legalization in many states to far too great an extent to suit me, as that money has become the controlling factor. And when it becomes the controlling factor, that means the lives and health of patients becomes deprioritized, and the lives of people who choose to incorporate this plant into their life becomes more about they're becoming a profit center to corporations by consuming cannabis rather than being fully in a relationship with a plant which they could grow themselves. And that's one of the many reasons I feel so strongly about the right of home grow and how crucial that is. Now, as far as marijuana activism,
Well, it is. I grow my own. I have internet commercial, but boy, I like that nothing on my cannabis.
right? I couldn't agree more, Paul. We are totally in accordance on that. And I think that once we balance our society a little better between um, capitalism and humanism, for lack of a better word, I think once we become more human centered and soul centered, heart centered than we are now, that there's nothing about this cannabis community that we can't fix. I think what we do have to be on guard against is being co opted by money and co opted by those kinds of rewards that many people in this movement apparently are satisfied to accept rather than the real change that we've got to have. And when I talk about the real change, I'm talking about across the board, because once you become conscious of your planet and of the web of life, you can't go back. This is something that is non negotiable, and we have to stick to our principles. Capitalism is something that can destroy the planet if allowed unchecked. The unbridled pursuit of profits at the expense of human beings is not a sustainable way to carry on with life. And that's why we've got to change that. That is why I draw a big bifurcation between the business of cannabis, with which I am disenchanted, and why I'm living out in the country by myself, and the culture of cannabis, the people of cannabis, the heart of cannabis. I think those are two very different things, and I think it's crucially important at this critical juncture of our movement and evolution as a species and as a cannabis community, that we not lose sight of the deep spiritual connection we have to this planet, to this plant, and to each other. And these connections can be revealed to us if we open ourselves up to them.
Yeah, I think we've been drawn to cannabis because of those spiritual connections. And that's one of the reasons we've co-evolved with cannabis. You look at the development of dogs, or Canis lupus familiaris. The technical term for wolves is Canis lupus, while all dogs are Canis lupus familiaris. Well, there are Great Danes, there are Chihuahuas, and there's everything in between, you know. And dogs have only been domesticated for about 7 to 12,000 years. There's some debate over that. But geneticists have analyzed the DNA pretty thoroughly and say all domesticated dogs come from a small handful, perhaps as few as 3 or 4 wolves in Central
Wow.
Asia. We can see how much our we've changed dogs. Well, cannabis has changed us, and we've changed cannabis in that 25,000 years in ways that we don't really understand. And we can't, given that we don't know what cultures were around prior to 5,000 years ago. Our oldest written histories go back that far. And we know that written histories are often written by the conquerors. And,
Right.
you know, you don't get the story, you know, but cannabis has been one in my talks, like I'm in Mexico now, I talk about how the symbiotic coevolution has taken place with cannabis and analyze ancient Chinese culture to modern day, ancient Japanese culture to modern day, a brief look at Egyptian culture, Scythians' domestication of the horses. The oldest written history from Herodotus talks about how the Scythians used cannabis in kind of a hotbox environment.
Mhm.
And I talk about that and Herodotus's writings about the Scythians and also about Judo-Christianity, how you know, it's cannabis was part of Judo-Christianity's holy anointing oil.
Right.
And, you know, when Moses went on top of the mountain to get the law from God, who did he talk to? Well, it was a burning bush, right? So we don't know what that burning bush is,
Exactly.
but we know that they were a cannabis cultivating uh, culture, you know, and but more and more about that is being discovered all the time.
The
It's so
coevolutionary aspect is really exciting me. The coevolution means that, like you say, we affect the cannabis plant, and the cannabis plant affects us. And I think now I'm strictly out on a limb hypothesizing here, but I think if a person cultivates strains of cannabis and selects the ones that address their symptom set most effectively, that goes beyond plain genetics. I think there's something else at work there, and I'm inclined to believe there is a sort of spiritual connection between the cannabis plant and the person, especially once that person starts cultivating and growing multiple generations of a strain. I think that strain may well adjust itself to more effectively address that individual person's symptom set if they cultivate that strain over a number of years with intent in mind. Intent is key, you know. And if you have healing intent and healthful intent and kind intent towards yourself when you're cultivating that strain, I believe that strain does adjust itself to better treat you every year that you grow it.
that's a fascinating theory. I don't think you're out on the limb. I think that's a very valid hypothesis, and how you can test it is another question. But let me go back to how you came to start working with us and how that ended, because you're one of the few people out there that has direct economic you know, impact of how this corporate theft affected you and how that came to an end for you working with our hemp.
You know, whenever you deal with corporations, and I don't want to overstate the case or put too fine a point on it, but when you deal with corporations, you're making deals with the devil. And, you know, you can take that literally or not, or metaphorically, or however you want, but you are making compromises. And, you know, I can definitively say that to work within the context of corporate profit centered America, you have to make compromises. And I was fully conscious at the time I made those. Okay, I'm making this compromise to get this much more of a platform, and you know, that worked for a while until it didn't, and I became unwilling to compromise to the extent in the direction of being absorbed into some corporate machine. When I became uncomfortable with that, I extricated myself from it. And to others, if you really feel, not you personally, I'm talking about the people out there who feel at home in a corporate environment within cannabis, then, enjoy yourself, but try not to exploit other people. Try not to take advantage. Try to maintain your honesty. Try to maintain your integrity, and try to remember that this universe that we're part of is eternal, and that these personal concerns of yours are going to go away real soon, but you will still have the energies to deal with it you created while you were alive.
Yeah, and we continue to do that. So after you left Hemp News, you want to talk about how you've come to because you're writing now for a pretty unique cannabis group started by Wes Abney. The Leaf started there in Washington and then Oregon, and now it's all over the country with a series of individual regional cannabis publications. And of course, for those kind of publications to be successful, they'd have to have a good advertising base.
Mm-hmm.
And Wes Abney and his team with the Leaf seem to have been able to do that.
They have done that, and amazingly so. I love the way that Wes has established a chain of locally based publications, and they all share some content and an editorial outlook in common, but they're each in tune to their local communities. And it's really working. I mean, he's gone against conventional wisdom, because conventional wisdom will tell you right now that print is a dying medium. West, though, has made a go of it in multiple states, and it's not a fluke, because now he's going in California, Oregon, Washington, the Northeast, Maryland, Alaska. Wherever he's gone, he's been able to make inroads and bring a lot of good information to a lot of people. And he's a good boss to work for as well. It's been 9 years that Wes and I have been associated, and we agree on goals. We agree on tactics, and we are of like mind.
Tell our audience more about the Leaf publications and your writing with them. I think yours are more kind of national stories that probably, well, you're focused on the internet. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Besides the print magazines that we were just discussing, of course, there is leafmagazines.com. We do web news. And there is a news section, a news page there on leafmagazines.com. Of course, there's a lot of other editorial content as well. There's the lifestyle stuff, a lot of stuff about dispensaries, shops you can go to in legal states and medical states. But beyond that, we keep a close check on the pulse of the news. And we covered, of course, from a pro-cannabis perspective, unashamedly and unreservedly pro-cannabis perspective. Wes has given me the latitude, God bless him, to call things as they are. I don't have to sugarcoat it. And when things need calling out sometimes, I'm able to go ahead and do that. It's a valuable thing. I believe that when you put the information out there, that people who are looking for the truth will be able to find it. And I think that truth seekers, will find truth if you put it out there for them. So I believe at the end of the day that we're doing a good thing, that we're bringing information to people, and hopefully we're raising consciousness about the value of this plant, the value of this culture, of the people who use it. And it's a value that I am not speaking of in financial terms. I'm speaking of it in terms that go far deeper than that.
So what is the audience on the website? Do you know, like you knew Talk of the Town was a 500,000 hits a month, is Freedom Leaf, or what is the website again?
Wes's
Yeah,
leafmagazines.com.
leafmagazines.com.
Leafmagazines.
What kind of audience?
I would love to know the traffic with Talk of the Town and Toke Signals. I was the guy with my hands on the controls and watching the page hit, so I knew exactly what the traffic was. With Leaf, I have no idea. I know that that my stories show up in web searches, so Google is cataloging them. We don't have nearly the oomph of some of the other sites right now, but we do have some loyal readers and people who enjoy us, and I enjoy bringing the news to them.
And 5 or 6 days a week, you send me a couple of your leaf articles, and I repost them to our hemp news sites on Facebook. I don't post them to our website, but I share them and help them out. I know you know that my CRRH Facebook page has about a little over 600,000 likes or followers, and so we do get some following there. It's shrunk about 100,000 over the past 6 or 7 years. It had been over 730,000, and now it's down to about 620,000.
Those
But
Facebook
still,
posts make a real impact. They make a positive impact, and they're good for traffic at leafmagazines.com. So we really appreciate those, both myself and Wes.
good, good. I'm glad he obviously wouldn't want it if it caused any problems. I'm glad that does. I haven't really had much communication with him. Tell him we need him, have him as a guest on our show whenever he gets a chance.
You know,
Or
that's a
I'll
great
reach out.
idea. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I'd love to interview him here and talk about how he's broken the model in terms of print media around cannabis.
Yeah, people, said it couldn't be done, and Wes is one of those guys that doesn't listen when you tell him it can't be done.
Right, right. So you left Washington State at some point and moved to Alabama, and now you're in Arkansas. And you're originally from not was Alabama, and you
Yeah.
moved back to your old home
Mhm.
area in rural Alabama for a while, but now just recently you moved to Arkansas. You want to talk about what caused that cultural shift in terms of the Northwest is radically different from the South. I grew up in the South, so I know that.
Mhm.
You grew up in Texas, North Carolina.
Right.
So how has that been working for you?
It works great on a personal level, because I deal with people one at a time, and it's no secret that in the South here, it's kind of the mirror image politically of the North. What that means for me on a practical level is that in Washington, 6 out of 10 people agreed with me on politics, and in Arkansas, 6 out of 10 people disagreed with me on politics. But that's fine. I mean, I can do what I do and try to bring as much consciousness and information and knowledge to the situation as possible, and avoid avoidable conflicts and meet them head on when they're unavoidable. The sad fact is, though, that politically speaking, I think that a lot of working class people in this country have been misled to vote against their own interests by a media environment which tends to encourage provincialism and tribal thinking rather than the synthesis of finding common ground.
Yeah, I think that's very clear that there's this false dichotomy out there that the corporate masters of the media perpetuate because it keeps us confused and allows them to the capitalist upper 1/10 of 1% to dominate the political process.
Yeah, and
But
I can't help from suspecting that there are some very cynical people behind the scenes that are manipulating the masses that way.
well, that's exactly how we got marijuana prohibition over 100 years ago. The the petrochemical, pharmaceutical, military, industrial, transnational, corporate elite, fascist sons of a bitches, to use Gatewood Galbraith of Kentucky's old phrase. They fed us this, and it's based on lies, and the whole thing is just so they can keep dominating the economic system and the political
Gatewood
system.
saw these things so clearly, and he saw them so early on. We were blessed to have him among us.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a shame he passed away just months, in 2012 before the first legalization measures
Yeah.
passed. But we had him up in Oregon in mid 2011, just at the start of our 2012 campaign, which did make the ballot, but failed at the same time that Washington passed and Colorado passed. And then we had the Drug Policy Alliance focusing on us. And that's kind of how they took over our corporation. Some of their, people came in with forgeries and lawyers and money and just took us out and bribed the
Well,
courts. It's clear now that, I was working with the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. Well, the DPA people, they got the Wobblies to start attacking us. And, they got the National Labor Relations Board on us, even though we were working with the unions already. It was just these false and buying a corrupt system, that led to that. But what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, some people say. And so I think that's the case. How is it in Alabama and now in Arkansas? You went from a legal environment, at least in terms of, and you could be arrested, I know, in Alabama and Arkansas if you don't. Well, definitely in Alabama doesn't have medical, does it?
They have a very weak medical law with no smoking and no flowers in Alabama. Arkansas, on the other hand, has a pretty good medical law. They're middle of the road medical law. There's no growing, and that's the biggest deficit. But we do have medical marijuana dispensaries. You can get a card, and it's got a pretty good law so that, a lot of people who need medical marijuana can get it here.
So we're about out of time, Steve. Let's talk about, if some of our viewers want to reach out to you or see what you're doing, how can they reach you?
They can visit my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/TokeSignalsGuy. And if they want to keep up with the work I'm doing, they can read any of the print editions of The Leaf, and they can go to leafmagazines.com and click on the news tab. And I update that 5 days a week with the latest news from a pro-cannabis perspective.
And so is there anything else you'd like to say in closing that we didn't cover that you want the audience or posterity to know?
Sometimes things seem dark when you're an activist and you're working towards a goal, but it's always darkest just before the dawn, and that we will ultimately prevail. The cause of consciousness and love and light will prevail.
Amen. Well, thank you for taking time to talk to me this morning, and I'll keep posting your Freedom Leaf stories as you send them to me, and I appreciate that. And I know the audience out there appreciates that. I'm glad it's beneficial for you and your employer. But thanks for coming on, and keep at it. Maybe someday we'll be in the same area and we can share some cannabis again.
I'd like that a lot, Paul. That would be great. Let's plan on it.
I'm looking forward to it. We've had Steve Elliott, longtime cannabis journalist, here on us, and I appreciate you being here. Just keep working on restoring hemp.
Will do.
Good night.